When Bush Jr. pulled Baker back into public life by naming him his special envoy on Iraq's debt, Baker did not have to cash out of the Carlyle Group or Baker Botts, despite its direct involvement in the war. At first, several commentators pointed out these serious potential conflicts. The New York Times published an editorial calling on Baker to resign his posts at the Carlyle Group and Baker Botts to preserve the integrity of the debt envoy position. Mr. Baker is far too tangled in a matrix of lucrative private business relationships that leave him looking like a potentially interested party in any debt restructuring formula, stated the editorial. It concluded that it wasn't enough for Baker to forego earnings from clients with obvious connections to Iraqi debts. To perform honorably in his new public job, Mr. Baker must give up these two private ones. In keeping with the example set at the top of the administration, Baker simply refused. And Bush backed his decision, leaving Baker in charge of the effort of persuading governments around the world to forgive Iraq's crushing foreign debt. After he had been in the role for nearly a year, I obtained a copy of a confidential document that proved that he was in a far more serious and direct conflict of interest than previously understood. The document was a 65-page business plan submitted by a consortium of companies, including the Carlyle Group, to the government of Kuwait, one of Iraq's main creditors. The consortium offered to use its high-level political connections to collect from Iraq $27 billion in unpaid debts to Kuwait, stemming from Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. In other words, to do exactly the opposite of what Baker was supposed to be doing as envoy, which was to convince government that Saddam-era debt should be cancelled. The document, titled Proposal to Assist the Government of Kuwait in Protecting and Realizing Claims Against Iraq, was submitted almost 2 months after Baker's appointment. It named James Baker personally 11 times, making it clear that Kuwait would benefit from working with a company that employed the man in charge of erasing Iraq's debts. But there was a price. In exchange for these services, the document said, the government of Kuwait would have to invest $1 billion with the Carlyle Group. It was straight-up influence peddling. Pay Baker's company to get protection from Baker. I showed the document to Kathleen Clark, a law professor at Washington University and a leading expert on government ethics and regulation. And she said Baker was in a classic conflict of interest. Baker is on two sides of this transaction. He is supposed to be representing the interests of the United States, but he is also a senior counselor at Carlyle, and Carlyle wants to get paid to help Kuwait recover its debt from Iraq. After examining the document, Clark determined that Carlyle and the other companies are exploiting Baker's current position to try to land a deal with Kuwait that would undermine the interests of the U.S. government. The day after my story about Baker was published in The Nation, Carlyle backed out of the consortium, forfeiting its hope of landing the $1 billion. Several months later, Baker cashed out of the Carlyle Group and resigned as general counsel. The real damage had been done. Baker had performed miserably as envoy, failing to secure the kind of debt forgiveness that Bush had pledged and Iraq required. In 2005 and 2006, Iraq paid $2.59 billion in reparation payments for Saddam's war, most to Kuwait. Resources that were desperately needed to meet Iraq's humanitarian crisis and to rebuild the country, especially after U.S. firms pulled out with the aid money squandered and the job left undone. Baker's mandate was to erase 90 to 95% of Iraq's debt. Instead, the debt was merely rescheduled and is still equivalent to 99% of the country's GDP. Other key aspects of Iraq policy were also handed to freelance envoys, whose companies earned record profits from the war. Former Secretary of State George Shultz headed up the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, a pressure group formed in 2002 at the request of the Bush White House to help it build a case for war in the public mind. Shultz certainly obliged. Since his role was at arm's length in the administration, he was able to whip up hysteria about the imminent danger posed by Saddam, entirely free from any burden of proof or fact. If there is a rattlesnake in the yard, you don't wait for it to strike before you take action in self-defense, he wrote in the Washington Post in September 2002 under the headline years earlier as CEO. The company would collect $2.3 billion to reconstruct the country that folks were so eager to see destroyed. And then there's Henry Kissinger, the man who kicked off the counter-revolution and pushed the court for Pinochet too. In his 2006 book, Ghost of the Nile, Bob Woodward revealed that Dick Cheney holds monthly meetings with Kissinger, while Bush meets with Kissinger about half as frequently, making him the most regular and frequent outside advisor to Clinton on foreign affairs. Cheney told Woodward, "I probably talk to Henry Kissinger more than I talk to Kissinger."